Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hello and welcome to episode number 237 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And to kick things off this week, I would like to say thanks to some of our newest Patreon subscribers. I would like to thank Summer, Nat Dwight, Amanda Bone, Shauna Cromwell, Emma, and Meredith Duke. Thank you so much for subscribing to the Patreon. I love you and appreciate you every single day. And our film review this week, our film review is Underwater. Underwater was released in 2020. It has 5.9 out of 10 on IMDb and 47% on Rotten Tomatoes. A crew of oceanic researchers working for a deep-sea drilling company try to get to safety after a mysterious earthquake devastates their deep water research and drilling facility located at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. So, full disclosure, I watched this film while I was being tattooed. So there may have been bits that I missed. I don't think I did. If I found myself being like, wait a second, what just happened? I did go back, 30 seconds to make sure that I was keeping on top of what was happening in this film. But game changer is watching a film while you're getting tattooed, because I was engrossed in the film and it made a pretty painful tattoo slightly easier. So the film gets a point for that alone, because if it had been a really bad film, I don't think it would have done what I needed it to do, which was to distract me from the pain. So I'm grateful for that. And I like a creature feature and I like an underwater film, And I think that if you put those two things together, I am going to enjoy it. And I did enjoy this. And I always think that anything that is filmed underwater has this benefit of being like simultaneously super claustrophobic and otherworldly, just by the very fact that it is underwater. So, chuck some monsters in there and I'm sold. I'm here. I'm holding my breath watching this film. One really good thing about this film too is that it started straight away. That sounds like a really stupid thing to say, but there was no big build up. There was no real context aside from their drilling in the Mariana Trench. There was no character setup. It was literally just Kirsten Stewart brushing her teeth and then bam, earthquake, or what they think is an earthquake. It was so quick that I actually thought when I was watching it that it was going to be like a dream sequence. Annoyingly, I was like, oh, this is definitely going to be a dream sequence, but it wasn't. It just gets straight into it, and I respected that. I appreciated it. There was no messing around, except for some slightly wanky dialogue that was sort of overdubbed, which I was like, oh, shut up and get on with the monsters and people being eaten, please, thank you. And because there's kind of no context for this film, you learn who the characters are and what they're all about as they are dealing with what's happening around them. So, they are survivors of this terrible, tragic accident that has happened on board this drilling rig under the sea. They're trying to get out. They need to get to somewhere in order to be able to evacuate from this place, and the only way to do that is to walk across the ocean floor in these sort of Fallout style big diving suits. And you're learning about how these people are coping with this and the shit that they've been through before, and that's I like to learn on the go about these characters. I like to figure them out as they are figuring shit out that is happening all around them. And there was one character that I absolutely loved. I think his name was Paul. And he was basically this big, straight-talking arsehole who was sort of, everybody was like, oh, Paul, you're so annoying, whatever. And he was really funny and witty and straight-talking and said exactly what you're thinking as the audience, said exactly what you would be saying or should be thinking in that situation, where he's like, I actually, personally don't think we should be splitting up and going out into the wilderness of the fucking ocean alone, because surely somebody's going to die, okay? And I did really enjoy watching his character. He made me very happy. He made me laugh. And they did a really good job of giving just sort of glimpses of the monsters. It was a very Lovecraftian film, and I liked and respected what they tried to do with it. I saw people in the Instagram comments being like, it was like the film Alien, but underwater. And yeah, I can kind of see that. So they kept the monsters like in the shadows. So you got fleeting glimpses of the monsters, or a monster would appear and, rip somebody into oblivion, whatever. And because they did that, and because they kept the visuals of the monsters to a minimum, it meant that they had loads to work with, right? They had loads they could do with it. Loads of fun shit happens. When I say fun shit, I mean it's fun to watch. Probably not fun to be involved with. And I respected that and I appreciated that. One of my big pet peeves is showing a monster too early and then you've got nowhere to go. Which leads me to my dislikes about this film. And I just think that it was just very forgettable. Like, it was grand. It was fine. I don't think Kristen Stewart is a good actor. So I've only really seen her in Twilight. I was trying to remember what I had seen her in. I know I watched her in a horror film that she did kind of pre-Twilight and she wasn't great. So I was interested to see her in something that was a bit more grown up, something that was a bit more meaty. Didn't think she was great. Didn't think she was the person for the job. I wasn't particularly rooting for her as a protagonist. She just didn't really give me much to work with. And also, right, this is a very particular complaint, but I'm just gonna put it out there. There were lots of long shots of Kristen Stewart's body, right? And she looks great. She looks beautiful. But it felt very male gazy, And when they were all getting into their like underwater fallout suits, there was another girl and Kirsten was like, hey, you need to take your trousers off. They're not going to fit in the suit. Which meant that the women were in their underwear when they were out of suits. But the men who were then shot out of suit were sort of wearing more. Which didn't really make sense in terms of the actual logistics of these suits. Except for the character of Paul, who was wearing like a really raggedy pair of boxer shorts, which I suppose added to his fun, quirky character. But yes, lots of long body shots, which was interesting. And I did wonder if maybe it was meant to be like a nod to Sigourney Weaver in Alien when she's wearing her underwear and that vest. I mean, maybe I'm giving them too much credit. I don't know. I did think that the lack of character development meant that we had these really strange plot points about characters that sort of went nowhere and added nothing at various points. It was very... There were bits in it where I was like, that's a bit weird. And that did nothing. Like, there was one character who is speaking about a member of his family, and then you find out later that what he said wasn't necessarily true. But it added nothing to the character or to the story or to the plot, which I thought was very strange, a very strange addition to the film. And look, I'm not going to tell you what the ending is, but I feel like it should have been kick-ass, right? It should have been an ending where you're like punching the air, potentially crying, that you're just like, yeah. But it was weak. It was weak. And I actually think the reason that the ending was weak was potentially because Kristen Stewart was not the right fit for the part. Am I bitter because she didn't cast me in her paranormal TV show? Maybe I am. But I have learned something from watching this film, and that is that we all need to stay out of the Mariana Trench. All of us. Nothing good comes out of there. Nothing good. Like, the Megalodon comes out of there. So do all other manner of mad creatures. All of whatever was going on in this film all came out of the Mariana Trench. Stay out of there. Don't go in there. I'm going to give it 3.5 stars. Half a star is going to the fact that it helped distract me during a particularly painful tattoo. So 3 stars, but 3.5 because I'm feeling generous.
If you're looking for plump lips that last, you need to know about Juvederm lip fillers. With Juvederm Volbella XC and Juvederm Ultra XC, your lip look, whether it's subtle or bold, can last up to 1 full year with optimal treatment and no additional maintenance. Find a licensed specialist and see if it's right for you at Juvederm.com today. That's JUVEDERM.com. Add fullness to lips in adults over 21 with Juvederm Volbella XC or Juvederm Ultra XC. Do not use if you have severe allergies or a history of severe allergic reactions, or if you're allergic to lidocaine or the proteins used in Juvederm. Tell your doctor if you have a history of scarring or taking medicines that decrease the body's immune response or that can prolong bleeding. Common side effects include injection site redness, swelling, pain, tenderness, firmness, lumps, bumps, bruising, discoloration, or itching. As with all fillers, there's a rare risk of unintentional injection into a blood vessel, which can cause vision abnormalities, blindness, stroke, temporary scabs, or scarring. For full, important safety information, visit Juvederm.com.
Hey there, it's Michelle Norris. I'm host of a podcast called Your Mama's Kitchen. When I travel, I'm usually looking for a way to find a taste of home when I'm not at home. And one of the things I love to do when I am at home is entertain. And Airbnb allows me to do that. When I was in California recently, I rented a house that had a great kitchen. And when we were sitting around the table, we were all thinking, we're in someone else's house. Someone could be in all of our homes as well. If you have a home, but you're not always at home, you have an Airbnb. Your home might be worth more than you think. Find out how much at airbnb.com/host.
Which brings us to our story this week. And our story this week is sort of more folklore based. And I came across this story last year when I was in Boscastle down in Cornwall, and it was absolutely beautiful. And we went to the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic, and I just want to give a very special shout out to the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic because the museum is great. Would highly recommend going if you are in the area. If you're in the southwest of England, try and get to Boscastle and try and get to the museum. And the museum itself is brilliant. It's got loads of great exhibitions about kind of old folklore, old medicine, about puppets, all sorts of different elements of witchcraft and magic. And I also reached out to them to tell them that I was doing this episode, and they pointed me to loads of really helpful information about the woman that is at the centre of the story today. So I just want to give a shout out to the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic. They have a gorgeous little museum, and the information, any of the sort of direct quotes that are in the story about Joan Wytte are taken from their leaflet that they produced all about the fighting fairy woman of Bodmin, Joan Wytte. So please do check them out if you can, and let's just get into the story. 3 miles away from this spot, you can find this prehistoric maize stone carved into a living rock face. Proof that from ancient times man and his magic making with the world of spirit were active in this area. The centuries have passed and times have changed, and yet all around us in this quiet corner of England there is a strange feeling that we are not alone, and that the shades of persons passed on and over into the world of spirit are very close. That is why this Museum of Witchcraft is located here. One is standing on the edge of the beyond. Cecil Williamson. I've spoken at length on the podcast about the strange beauty of the moors. Last year, whilst visiting Bodmin Moor and Bodmin Jail, I was struck by how isolated and beautiful the moors were, how easily it would be to become lost and disorientated, how quickly the weather can change and the devastating impact of this. I was struck by how much of a lonely place it must have been to live, and how life must have been harder and made harder by the environment and the elements. Our story today centres around the coastal village of Boscastle. I had never heard of it, and did not know of the joy that was waiting for me there. It is a tiny place, and in the 1500s it was described as being very filthy and ill kept. It was a port that imported limestone and coal and exported slate and other local produce. Boscastle benefited from slate quarrying for many years. In 2004, Boscastle made headlines as it was extensively damaged in a flooding incident. A month's worth of rain fell in 2 hours, and in this terrible perfect storm, this coincided with the ground already being oversaturated from excessive rainfall over the previous 2 weeks. The fact that Boscastle sits on the confluence of 2 rivers, and it all happened at high tide. It really was a disaster. 91 people had to be evacuated. The visitor centre was washed away. Roads were submerged under 9 feet of water. Homes, businesses and cars belonging to 1,000 people were swept away, and Boscastle was declared temporarily inaccessible. But the village recovered, and it truly is a remarkable place. It is undoubtedly picturesque, with breathtaking views, and there is a sense of wild romanticism about it. And really, it is no surprise that Boscastle is the home of the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic. And the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic is where I learned about the story of a remarkable woman named Joan Wytte. Boscastle may seem like a strange home to a Museum of Witchcraft and Magic, but like I said, it has a sense of wild romanticism, and it makes it just perfect. A sense of somehow being closer to nature and more aware of your surroundings. As the quote at the beginning of the story states, it really does feel like you're standing on the edge of the beyond. The museum itself didn't begin its life in Boscastle. It was originally set up in Stratford-upon-Avon and was met with significant backlash from the local people. And so in 1951, Cecil Williamson moved the museum to the Isle of Man, where it was opened as the Folklore Centre of Superstition and Witchcraft. Not only was there a relocation, but the centre was home to a resident witch, Gerald Gardner, who some of you may know as the founder of modern Wicca. As time passed, the men struggled to find a sustainable way to manage their working relationship as their interests became more and more divergent. Eventually, Williamson returned to the mainland and set up the Museum of Witchcraft in Boscastle in 1960. Williamson was a skilled filmmaker and used his talents to create exhibitions in the museum that benefited from his theatrical eye. He gathered and displayed magical objects, and he paid particular attention to what was known as wayside magic, a magic that was used by local people, healing and charms that were popular and aided in a variety of life issues and ailments. Potions and tinctures and healing with nature and poppets and spells were all part of this brand of folk magic. Williamson curated and displayed skulls and bones, images of witchcraft, demons and magic from books throughout the ages. He displayed different types of staffs used in magic rituals. He displayed taxidermy, poppets and statues of magical significance. He used mannequins to demonstrate magical rituals. For some, these displays may have seemed shocking and in some cases frightening, but they were a nod to a different way of life, and an attempt to respect and recognise and preserve the old ways. One of the displays that was prominent in the museum was a skeleton. The skeleton of a woman held together with wires. The skeleton of Joan Wytte. Joan Wytte was born in 1775 in Bodmin. The Wytte family, it would seem, were a family of toners, which meant that they made white leather, which had become an increasingly popular material used for both ladies' and men's gloves, for gauntlets, boots and shoes. The Wyttes weren't always toners. They'd started out as weavers and yarn twisters and had moved and adapted with the times to become toners when weaving and yard spinning began to die out as a profession. Joan Wytte was a small woman, and by all accounts she was feisty, fiery and opinionated. She was known for having a big mouth and being a fighter. She had a small frame, small-boned and thin and undernourished. Her arms seemed to be much too long for her frame, and her fingers were long and slender and resembled bird-like claws. It would be fair to say that Joan Wytte stood out. Joan was small and fiery, a spindly creature, with bird-like features and an uncanny ability to predict the future. Or so they said. She was a seer, a clairvoyant, and a healer. People believed that this little creature had a touch of magic about her, like she somehow had 1 foot in the realm of the living and 1 foot in the realm of the dead. She had a power to heal, to cure ailments with various herbs, potions and tinctures. She used cluties in her practice, which were strips of cloth taken from the clothes of the sick person and tied to a tree or a holy well. And when the cloth rotted, the disease would dissipate. And while Joan Wytte had strange abilities, she also had a dark side. From her 20s onwards, she became angry, bitter and violent. She would fly into dark rages where she would become aggressive and sometimes physically fight people. It was said that in these violent fits she possessed the strength of many men and would be able to fight multiple people, somehow even being able to physically lift and throw people. It would take numerous people to subdue her, and she became known as the Fighting Fairy Woman of Bodmin. Her fighting eventually landed her in Bodmin Jail, where she died of bronchial pneumonia in 1813. But that is not where her story ends. Joan Wytte was an enigma in life. The Fighting Fairy Woman of Bodmin with a tiny frame and a bad attitude, and she was just as much of an enigma in death. A man named William Clift had been working at what we now know as the Hunterian Museum of the Royal College of Surgeons in London. He was employed by the museum to make drawings of thousands of medical specimens and curiosities. But during this time period he had a breakdown and returned to Cornwall on sick leave. It was during this period of time, in February 1813, that he met the surgeon in charge of Bodmin Jail, John Hamley. John Hamley had taken the time to make plaster casts of the heads of prisoners of Bodmin Jail, and he was keen to show them to William Clift. And not only that, but he had the body of the recently deceased Fighting Fairy Woman. Clift, of course, was interested in the body and wanted it fleshed and prepared in order to be put on display at the museum. Hamley assured Clift that he would be able to flesh and prep the body, and that as soon as the skeleton was ready he would have it sent to the museum in London. Her bones never made it to London. Cecil Williamson, the curator of the Museum of Witchcraft, believed the reason that the bones never made it to London was that the bones were badly prepared and badly displayed. They were put into a prison storeroom and forgotten about. What happened next is taken directly from Williamson's notes as outlined in the Fighting Fairy Woman of Bodmin Jail, produced by the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic. So the skeleton was put away into the prison's medical storerooms and forgotten. That is until the prison had a new governor in the form of one William Hicks, who had a great reputation throughout the southwest for being a wit and a great practical joker. So it came about that William Hicks came to learn of Joan Wytte's skeleton in its storeroom cupboard, and of course of her past reputation for the veracity of her predictions. Hicks was delighted. Just what the doctor ordered, an ideal setup for a major practical joke. So invitations to attend a dinner party and an evening of entertainment were sent to all the leading citizens of Bodmin. On that fateful evening, dinner having been taken, the guests were bidden to adjourn to a specially prepared room where there were seats for all. Facing them, with its door closed, was Joan Wytte's cupboard. William Hicks explained that they were going to take part in a séance in which the skeleton of Joan Wytte would play the part of the medium, answering all questions posed by giving a number of raps from within her cabinet. To that end, 3 large human bones were provided. 1 bone was placed within Joan's upright cupboard to be used by her for giving her answering raps. 1 was held by the yes person and the other by the no person. The procedure being, someone poses a question, the yes person calls out the command of, "Make 3 taps, Joan, if your answer be yes," and the yes person strikes the floor with his bone 3 times. The no person then commands Joan, if her answer is no, to rap like this, and the no person drums a rattle of blows on the floor. Off stage, the governor had an accomplice to play Joan's part in giving the rapping answers. The whole thing could be a hilarious jape. Or so the governor thought. The séance commenced and all was proceeding as planned when suddenly the door to Joan Wytte's cupboard burst open, and with a whoosh like the sound made by a gust of wind, her bone for supposed rapping took to the air, and at the same instant the other 2 bones held by the yes and no persons wrenched themselves from the hands holding them. Then a poltergeist-like attack began in earnest. The 3 flying bones struck and belaboured the heads and shoulders of the audience as if they were handheld cudgels. Pandemonium broke out. Then, as suddenly as it started, the attack ceased. So much for William Hick's evening of practical joking. Joan's bones were hastily put back into prison storage until the prison was shut down in 1927. Her skeleton was passed to a medical professional and eventually fell into the hands of Cecil Williamson, who placed her in the Witchcraft Museum. Williamson believed that her bones brought the museum good fortune. The existence of the museum had caused considerable controversy in the area. The Anglican Church were not happy that a museum of this nature had been set up. In a letter written by Williamson, he stated, "In 1960 I put together and presented to the public my collection of witchcraft relics at Boscastle. Once again, as was the case with my Museum of Witchcraft at Bourton on the Water in Gloucestershire, I faced bitter opposition from the Anglican Church, who did their best to close the museum and to have it run out of town. But this time I had a helping hand in the form of the mortal remains of Joan Wytte that I had put on display in the museum. Over a relatively short space of time, there were 4 church-inspired major incidents, all of which ended to my advantage in an unexpected and startling manner, for which I give Joan the entire credit and my eternal thanks." It is clear that Williamson respected the story of Joan Wytte in his own way. He recognised that she was a powerful woman in life and indeed in death. But there was a change. In 1996, Williamson sold the museum to Graham King. The new curators of the museum felt that Joan Wytte needed to be elsewhere. There were reports of poltergeist activity that was believed to stem from the spirit of Joan Wytte. The museum staff consulted Cassandra Latham Jones, a well-known witch, and it was decided that it was time for Joan to receive a proper burial. Her body was removed from display. The wires that held her skeleton together were removed, and she was buried in a simple grave in a secret location in the woodlands. She was buried with a clay pipe, some tobacco, some brandy, some oils and herbs, and some incense. It was hoped that through this simple burial, Joan would finally find peace. Her gravestone, which is kept separately from where her body is buried to retain the secrecy of the location, simply reads, Joan Wytte, born 1775, died 1813 in Bodmin Jail, buried in 1998, no longer abused. Joan Wytte was not persecuted for her witchcraft, but she was certainly feared, a story which is all too common. I think that it was important that her bones got the respect they deserved, not used in practical jokes or seances or gawped at by strangers, but peacefully and respectfully placed in a quiet and beautiful place. There are some interesting things about Joan that lend a sort of credence to the stories about her abilities. First, when an examination was done on her skeleton, it was revealed that she had a huge abscess in one of her back teeth. It is likely that this caused her a massive amount of pain, which would account for the reports of her foul temper. Perhaps it doesn't account for the reports that she had superhuman strength, though. Although it could be suggested that this was maybe an exaggeration by people who were already quite afraid of this bird-like woman. The second thing of note is that Joan Wytte had very healthy bones. She was malnourished and had subsided on a heavily flour-based diet, so lots of bread, etc. But her bones were healthy. They were full of fluoride. Turns out that Joan Wytte lived near a sacred well, and that well, as was later scientifically tested, was actually full of fluoride and naturally occurring minerals. Joan would have consumed this water and likely used it to create healing potions. So we can assume that the reports of her healing abilities and the reports of her foul temper were true. Her abilities as a seer were well celebrated, but we will never know the veracity of these claims. If there's nothing else to take away from this story, I think there should be a recognition to be made that these stories and folktales often have a grain of truth. Sometimes it's bigger than a grain. Stories of women who could magically heal and holy wells that could cure illnesses potentially have some serious scientific grounding. To round out this episode, I think it is fitting in this instance to tell you briefly about another place that was once thought to be magical, but as it happens has a very tangible basis in reality. The Valley of the Mad. The information in this portion of the episode is taken directly from an article written by Pollyanna Jones for hubpages.com. Located in the southwesterly tip of Ireland, Kerry arguably boasts some of the world's most beautiful coastlines. Rugged mountains plunge their roots into the shining sea with scenery largely unspoiled by modern life. It is here that you will find the Dingle Peninsula and the Slieve Mish mountain range. The region is a treasure trove of historical sites dating from Ireland's very earliest Mesolithic finds at Ferreter's Cove from 10,000 to 5,000 BC to early Christian sites such as the Riask monastic settlement, circa 500 AD. On the northern side of the Slieve Mish, along the road from Anniscall to Tralee, the small valley of Glennanyalt is located at the end of a remote lane. And this area is rich with stories, and lots of these stories feature madness. For example, there is a story of an ancient princess who witnesses the death of her father and drinks his blood, and as a result retreats into the mountains a wild animal, a lunatic. A princess who is later cured by a man who cooks and feeds her meat and washes her in the warmed water from the spring. Many of these stories were restored by contact with the Blasket Islanders, a small community of Irish speakers. Peg Sayers, who was a celebrated Shankie, which means an old storyteller, lived in the Blasket Islands and told stories to Kenneth Jackson, a scholar from Cambridge, stories of the land that was an attempt to teach him Irish. She spoke of Glennanyalt in a story of a young woman who went mad after the loss of her lover. She and other troubled souls would flee to the isolated valley to live wild, as the princess had done in the old story. They would live among the trees and drink the spring water. Another tale tells of King Balkan of France, who was cured of madness after drinking the spring water of Glennanyalt, following his flight from the Battle of Ventry. Bridget O'Connor, who lives in the valley, recalls many tales of the mad that were told to her by her father, Tom Bat O'Connor. He described how people would instinctively come to the valley. There are tales of those of troubled mind that would come to drink the water and return home cured. Another story tells of a man named Michael Nabuilla, otherwise called Michael of the Madness or Mad Mick. There are myriad stories associated with And there seems to be a theme in this particular area. But why? In July 2012, a team of scientists travelled to Glendenyault to find out if they could figure out why the valley had this reputation. Was there anything behind these myths and legends and stories? Quite often, folklore is a way in which local knowledge of an event or anything else of significance is passed down through the generations. And while folk stories can be muddled up, they can be confused, they can be mixed together, like I said, there is often a grain of truth in them. The curing powers of the waters of Glendenyault had long been believed to ease madness, and the team visited the valley to analyse the facts to see if there was any basis for these stories. The valley and subsequent study was filmed for the Irish television channel TG Cahir and their series Cugger, and was televised in 2012. Samples of the water were taken for analysis by scientists, and the results were astonishing. The spring water contained a high amount of the chemical element lithium. This was a much higher content than recorded in other samples taken from the waters nearby. Lithium is used in the production of medicine to treat bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and depression. So it would seem that there is a method in the madness of Glendenyault. One has to only untangle the myths of an area to learn the secrets passed down through word of mouth. Science is finally proving the wisdom of folklore, which recorded the qualities of this water for so long. So a little bit of a deep dive into some folklore there. And if you listen to the Blind Boy podcast or even Off Menu podcast, Glendenyault has come up a couple of times in podcasts, etc. lately and has gotten some recognition. So I thought, when I read about Joan Wytte and the fact that the spring near her house was actually full of fluoride and other minerals that were generally good for you, I was like, there's a link here to Glendenyault, which for years it was just seen as folk stories, the Valley of the Mad. There's also a stone in Glendenyault, which is said to be like the Stone of the Mad. It's a stone that has a dip or a hollow in it, which is believed to be some sort of Bronze Age art. And people for years believed that if you put your head against the stone, it would cure your madness. And just to be clear, I'm using the words, mad and lunatic and those words because those are the words that are used in the folklore relating to this place. They're not words that should be used as descriptors of mental illness now. But it is really interesting that all of these stories of, lunatics in inverted commas and madness seem to have happened in this one particular valley, Glendenyault. And a lot of the stories, as with folklore, they get intertwined, they get mixed up, names get changed, and then when the names get changed you end up with two different stories that are slightly different, and then they change even more over time and you end up with loads of stories. And there's just, stories of people who went mad because they danced with the fairies in Glendenyault. There's stories of people who went mad in the valley and were never cured. And like I said, there's the very involved story of the princess who the mountain range is named after, who witnessed her father's death and went mad with grief and drank his blood and turned into like an animal, a crazed animal, and went off to live in the wildness of Glendenyault, and then was eventually tamed, for want of a better word, by a man who fed her and bathed her in the water of the spring. And these stories centre around this one particular place. And I do think it's really interesting that these scientists then went, I wonder why this place is called Glendenyault, and I wonder why, there's all these folk stories of people going and being cured of their madness, which was clearly people with mental illnesses who were going to the valley, drinking the water and feeling better because of the lithium content in the water. It's incredible. And of course, people at the time, they weren't going to be like, oh, I wonder if there's lithium in the water, because they wouldn't have known what lithium was. So all they knew is in this particular valley, if you were suffering from some sort of mental illness, you could go and drink this water and you might feel better for a period of time. And there was another folk story from that part of the world that I spoke about on Patreon about a particular song called Burt na Pookie, which is a traditional piece of Irish music that is very famous. And the man who wrote the song believed that the song was given to him by the fairies. He was on a boat and there was suddenly this fog all around him and he heard this beautiful song and he believed it was from the fairies, and he went home and he wrote down the music that he heard, and his family were really famous musicians, and this song was the product of that. And that story is, that was sort of told relatively recently in history. So the story itself was true. He believed that he had heard the fairies, he wrote down the song. And a person who was studying music decided they wanted to investigate what the real story was behind that song. And they realised that what this man was probably hearing was actually whale song. And because he was in a particular type of boat that had animal skin stretched over the bottom of it, it was acting as like a speaker and reverberating the whale song, so it didn't sound like it was coming from in the water. You know what I mean? It sounded like it was all around him. And they believed that this song that this man heard was actually not fairies, but whales. And I think that's incredible, because it doesn't make the story any less true. It's simply just a different explanation for what really happened. And if you're an Irish person, you will know that there are wells and trees, etc., all over the country that are said to cure various ailments. And regularly in Ireland you will also see clooties, which are those little pieces of cloth tied around fairy trees or healing trees that are said to help heal people when they are sick, and when the cloth rots, their illness will dissipate. And it does make you wonder, particularly in the case of healing wells, what was in that water naturally occurring that maybe did actually heal people. And in regards to the story of Joan Wytte, I really loved the story. And what I really loved is that eventually people looked at her bones and said, whatever happened in your life, you didn't deserve to be disrespected in your death. And it's time that we take a step back and give you the burial that you deserve. And they went about it so respectfully. They contacted a local witch, got her involved. They buried her in a secret location specifically because they didn't want people going disturbing her grave. There were concerns that people would try and dig up her bones, etc., etc. So the location of her grave has been kept a secret. And people do like little pilgrimages now to her gravestone, to her memorial, in order to leave gifts, etc. for her. And when I spoke to the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic, they said that there were no kind of Joan Wytte related paranormal incidents that they were aware of since her bones have left the museum. And it's fair to say that this woman, like I said in this story, this woman would have stood out. She was smaller than average. She had these long fingers. She had arms that were longer than average. She obviously had a raging temper in her later years. I say later years, in her 20s, because she had this giant abscess in her tooth. I'd be fucking angry too. I'd be angry too if I was going around with an abscess in my tooth. She was probably in a huge amount of pain all of the time. And if you've ever had toothache, I very thankfully have not often had toothache. It was when I had my braces and they were tightened was the time when I most often had toothache, and it is unpleasant. It is a pain that is like no other because it is so annoying and you just can't seem to get away from it. So it kind of makes sense that she was pretty foul-tempered and angry. And of course, like I said, there was the suggestion from these stories that she, was able to fight with the ability of 5 men, and she had all this strength and she would lift people up and throw them, and you could never subdue her when she started fighting. I think it's possible that maybe that is exaggerated, like I said, by people who were already quite frightened of this woman, who seemed to have the ability to see the future and who seemed to be able to heal people. And maybe her ability to see the future, maybe she was just intuitive and shrewd. Maybe she just, had a good grasp of people and was able to kind of see where a particular pathway could potentially lead somebody, I do think it is very refreshing in this story that she wasn't jailed for her witchcraft. She wasn't jailed for being a healer or being clairvoyant. Like, that wasn't why she ended up in prison, which is a good thing, because she ended up in prison for fighting, and actually, fair. That's reasonable. If you're going around scrapping with everybody, that's not okay. And as we know, prisons in that day and age, in the early 1800s, they were pretty grim places, and disease was rife. And if there was disease or infection, you were going to get it in prison. But she definitely, in her death, regardless of the fact that she was a fighter in life, she didn't deserve to be, her bones didn't deserve to be treated as sort of this practical joke or this spectacle to stare at, And the fact that the governor of the prison was like, found her bones and was like, I've got the best idea for a joke. I'm going to scare the shit out of everybody by doing a seance and using her bones to do the seance. Like, come on, you're asking for trouble. And I mean, who knows how much of that story is true. Cecil Williamson was very taken by the story of Joan Wytte and seems to have researched her story quite in depth. Who knows how true that story is. It could have been just another story that kind of lent itself to the veracity of the claims about her, and it lent itself to solidify her bones as like a haunted item worth seeing. And I was very curious about what Williamson meant by church-inspired incidents, because he talks about how when he acquired the bones, he put the bones up, and the Anglican Church weren't happy with the Witchcraft Museum being there, but he believed that Joan Wytte, that her skeleton kept the Anglican Church at bay with these church incidents. But I can't quite figure out what these church incidents might be. Like, what was it? What were these incidents that sort of ended to his advantage in an unexpected and startling manner, is what he said. 4 church-inspired major incidents, all of which ended to my advantage in an unexpected and startling manner. And he says, for which I give Joan the entire credit and my eternal thanks. I'm not entirely sure what that means or what that could mean. Clearly some things happened that meant that the Anglican Church backed off trying to get the Museum of Witchcraft shut down and ran out of town. And I'm glad it did, because the museum is definitely worth visiting, 100%. If you are in that part of the world, I would suggest it. This isn't an ad for the museum, by the way. It may sound like it. It is not, I promise. This was a story that I wanted to cover because I think it's really important that we respect people's lives and respect them in death too, Joan Wytte was a real woman who lived and died and probably had a very tough life for myriad reasons, and I don't think she deserved to have her bones used in a cheap practical joke. And I am glad that eventually her bones were buried in a way that was respectful to her. And I think if we can take anything away from this episode, it is stay out of the Mariana Trench, obviously, but also don't dismiss folklore so easily. You never know what little scientific basis stories might have. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode, which was very much a little folkloric jaunt, which I enjoyed. If you would like to send in your own story, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website, reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.